Hi, I'm Dr. John Neufeld. Welcome to Back to the Bible Canada, and on an ongoing series of Jesus' journey to the cross. And today I want to take us through, the trial of Jesus. But before I do, I want to step back and talk about, these life-transforming moments. There are great moments of history in which the world is changed on a very small piece of ground, a little piece of geography. I mean, if I could think of an example of that, it would be BC 49. And in the year 49 BC, Julius Caesar, who was not Caesar yet, but Julius, crossed the Rubicon. And that was a defining moment because in the Roman government, no Roman general could cross the Rubicon with a standing army. That was considered a threat. So you stand down and you come over unarmed as a symbol of peace. You walk over with a fully armed military, and that's a declaration of war. You do that, you're either gonna win the day and conquer Rome, or you're going to be tried for treason. So when Caesar crosses the Rubicon, we've all heard that, crossing the Rubicon. You see, when he crossed the Rubicon, the die was cast, and he had but one way to go. Now, Jesus had crossed his own Rubicon, as you already know. Jesus had entered into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. The cries were, "Hail to the King." He comes mounted on a donkey in fulfillment of the prophecy of Zechariah, and he does so deliberately. The next day he walks into the temple, he overthrows the money changers and everything else. I mean, at this point in time, the die is cast. There's no way back. Jesus doesn't say, guys, I'm sorry for all the disturbance, I'll just go back to my home. No, that's not going to happen. It's only going to happen now straightforward. He's either going to conquer Jerusalem or he's going to lose his life. That's what was already decided. Now, of course, Jesus had told his disciples, Matthew 20, verse 18, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death." Now, I've said before that Jesus was orchestrating these events. He was directing, the choir, if you will. He was directing all of the reactions to him. He was pushing his enemies into a corner so that they're left with no alternative but to put him to death. They had wanted to put him to death, but after Passover, because too many people were present during Passover, they wanted this thing done in quiet. I mean, he's just supposed to disappear, and nobody was to be any the wiser. Jesus, however, was operating according to the framework of God. So on the one hand, you've got the Pharisees saying this is when we're going to plan to kill Jesus, but there's a divine mandate that Jesus must die at Passover. So, the divine mandate always wins. So here we have Jesus. He has crossed the Rubicon, if you will. And this little bit of ground here in Jerusalem will become the stage for the trial, the crucifixion, the burial, and then the resurrection of Jesus. Well, so let's take it to this issue of the trial. I mean, it's evening on Friday. Jesus has already spent the night with his disciples in the upper room. Judas has gone out to seek for a means to betray him. Jesus goes down into the Kidron Valley. He crosses it, and if you heard me last time, I said, there would have been blood that would have been on the fringes of his robe. By the time Judas led the troops to arrest Jesus, you would have had, Jesus with his forehead streaked with the blood that came from the intensity of the experience of his prayer. So, you see a bloody Jesus that was there when they finally did arrest him, and that forms a very symbolic scene for everything that was coming next. Well, most people, when they talk about the trial of Jesus, whatever they know about it, will say it was an illegal trial, and that's true. Jewish law forbade a trial to be held at night. It had to be done during the day in the full view of people. I mean, justice can't just be done, it must be seen to be done, and so this would have been illegal to do. So we know it was an illegal trial, but really that's not the entire story. Fact is, Jesus didn't have one trial, he had 6. He went through 6 trials, and each one of them is a mockery of justice. And we're going to trace those 6 trials, and we're going to see something that we might learn in our own personal lives from what happened to Jesus. So let's take us to trial number 1. Trial number 1 is an interesting trial because it happens, Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane. He has deliberately placed himself where he could be found, and he's being led away, and the Bible says he was led to the house of Annas. Now, Annas is called a high priest, but technically he's not serving as high priest. He has a son-in-law, the man who married his daughter. That man is now the acting high priest. Annas had been the high priest. So if you can think of the American system where in the U.S., somebody who has served as president is still called the president. And so Annas was still called high priest, even though he wasn't the acting high priest. Nonetheless, Jesus is brought to the home of Annas, where he directs his son-in-law, Caiaphas, the high priest, in terms of what to do. You see, Annas is an interesting man. I mean, through his history, Caiaphas wasn't any better, but Annas was a man who knew how to control other people. He was merciless. He was power hungry. He didn't care who got hurt along the way. He got his way. And Annas loved his role of being the person who directed the current high priest. It served him well that this man was his son-in-law, that is Caiaphas. So Annas liked to be, if you will, the neck that turns the head. So if there's any problem, all of the problem will be directed toward Caiaphas. Nonetheless, that's where the first trial is actually held. So like a real man of power, he wants to make sure if there's a problem, the blame is going to fall on Caiaphas. And so they hold these secret meetings with Jesus, and they're seeking to bring charges against him, and they're testing Jesus to see what will stick. I mean, if we throw enough mud at him, let's see what's going to stick. And Caiaphas is given the responsibility in the house of Annas to question Jesus to see if they can hang something on him. And so they question him about his teaching, and Jesus responded, according to the scripture, he said that nothing that he had taught had been done in secret. It had all been done in public, so it's a matter of public record. And so if you want to know what I've said, go ask the people who heard me teach. And that's as far as Jesus would go. Well, that infuriated them so much that immediately an officer that was standing beside Jesus hit him in the mouth, right on the mouth. That's illegal as well. So he's beginning to harass the prisoner, trying to get him to say what they wanted to say, but he leaves it at that. Jesus will not speak at this, mock trial in the house of Annas, where a few men have gathered together in a dark room to concoct their purpose. He's going to give them nothing at that point in time. So the first trial of Jesus in the house of Annas really is a mock trial, and it ends in utter failure. But all the while this was going on, Peter is standing outside of Annas' house. He's promised Jesus he's not going to abandon him, and so he's trying as best he can to keep his promise, but nothing normal is going on, and the intensity is clearly rising. And while he's there, there's a slave girl that must have been from, Annas' house, and she says to him, "Aren't you one of his followers?" Now, who is this slave girl? Now, Peter can only think that, maybe she's going to go out and blab it to everyone else, and he's going to be in trouble, and he's going to be dragged away, and he can't stay with Jesus. He's got all sorts of justifications going on in his mind, and she's only a slave girl. Surely she's not important. So in her presence, he denies that he ever knew him. First denial of Peter. Well, having failed to gain any kind of traction in the house of Annas, they decide that as Annas and Caiaphas and a couple of the leading priests that were there, they decide to move Jesus into a more official setting. And this will now be in the official courtyard of the high priest. It's a setting of his office. So this is the courtyard of Caiaphas. This is where the second trial, and since the first one produced nothing at all, they decide another approach. So while they're already quickly bringing together key people into the house of Caiaphas, they're also rounding up the worst scoundrels in Jerusalem. These people are going to be called upon to give testimony. What have you heard him say? I mean, after all, he's challenged them already. You ask them. Well, they're going to get out the worst possible people to give testimony. And so the plan is hastily put together, call all the false witnesses, call the disreputable people, and get them to condemn Jesus in the courtyard of Caiaphas. Well, the name devil, it's a name that we all know. And the name actually, from the Greek, it means, it's diabolos, and it means the slanderer. This is what Satan does best of all. He is an effective slanderer. Simply bring enough charges. And in the back of everybody's mind, these charges will compound. There'll be one after another. And in most people's mind, if there are enough witnesses, where there's smoke, there's got to be fire. That's how they think. Satan knows that. He knows the gullibility of people. And so he knows that slander is effective. So the first man gets up and he says, I know an incident where Jesus taught in this city, and he said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will build it again. So they begin to say, well, this is an act of terrorism. Jesus was teaching and encouraging vandalism and terrorism against the Jewish temple. That's a serious charge. Well, then, the next witness arrives, and the next witness, and soon it becomes, quite clear that there's chaos between the witnesses. Sometimes a witness will say the exact opposite of the one who has been before him, and so the witness testimonies are beginning to contradict himself, and there's chaos, and all the while there stands Jesus, and he's not asked, and he makes no defense at all. And finally, as things are going badly, because clearly, this group of witnesses are not to be trusted, and it's not turning out as well as they thought. Caiaphas decides, I won't let this second trial end in the same failure as the first one did. So in desperation, he directly decides he's going to question Jesus himself. And here's his question, are you the Christ? And then he adds, the Son of the Blessed One. Are you the Messiah? That's the first question. Second, are you the Son of the most blessed on high God? And then, just having been quiet this whole while, Jesus not having said a thing up till now, you might have expected, he still will refuse to speak. But on this moment, at this very point in time, he chooses this moment, he breaks his silence, and he speaks. Here's his willing reply. You yourself have said it, he said. And you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power, coming in the clouds of heaven. He's quoting Psalm 110 and Daniel 7, verse 13. And, the high priest, who's Caiaphas, screams. It seems it's over dramatic, but he's now screaming, and he's tearing his robes as a sign of mourning, as a sign something is very wrong, and he screams out, blasphemy! Blasphemy, blasphemy, that's blasphemy. We don't need any more witnesses, he says. Right here is the evidence that we've been looking for. What do you think? He asks the elders that are there, and they all answer, to a man, he's deserving of death. And then as if Satan enters the room himself, and suddenly there's all dignity of the proceeding that's lost. Nobody's even trying to make it sound like this is an official legal trial. In fact, what's happening now is that they're spitting into his face, they're roughing him up, they're punching him with fists, and some are even slapping him and screaming, you prophesy, O Christ, who just slapped you? So all dignity is lost, and they become a howling mob in this second trial. That's how it ends. It descends into chaos. So the second trial ends, and the third one is about to begin. And before the third trial, however, begins, I've got to update the matter of Peter. Most of this story is known to everyone. Peter by now will have denied Jesus a second time and then a third time, and the second and the third time is while he's standing out in the courtyard in the high priest's official residence. And there Peter denies that he knows him 3 times, and the rooster crows, so we're now coming to the morning light. Luke tells us that at that very moment, when Peter denies Jesus the third time, that Jesus is then being led out of the high priest's official residence, and he must have been beaten and he's spit upon, and as he's being led out, Peter is busy denying Jesus the third time. and Jesus is looking straight at Peter. And as he does, Peter it's more than he can bear. He runs from that place, he deserts Jesus, and he cries bitterly. So Jesus is moved then. So we have the end of the second trial, and we're now beginning the third trial, and Jesus is then moved to what is called the Sanhedrin, and here will be the most official of the Jewish trial. This will be a gathering of 70 leaders in Israel, and they will be called together, and they will be there to hear the evidence. So they're called at an emergency meeting. They must all be there immediately. You can imagine they're being rushed out of their houses. You've got to get here. This has got to be done as quickly as we can. They need Jesus taken care of this very day. Now, here they not only, they don't. So here, when we look at this third trial, we'll notice that there are no witnesses brought here. That sordid mob that we had before, they're not called upon to come back. I mean, everyone knows that's a disaster, and we can't let that disaster happen again. What's going to happen is the questioning that Caiaphas was engaged in. If they could get Jesus to repeat what he said before, then they'd have him to be sure. So here we are in trial number 3 in the Sanhedrin, the official courtroom, and the questioning, they start out really slowly. They try to be benign. If you are the Christ, if you're the Messiah, tell us. And Jesus is very coy with them. He says, I won't tell you because you won't believe me even if I did. And so things aren't going to look like they're going to go easy. And so they're wondering, how do you get him to repeat what he said in the previous trial? And so they think, they're going to have to find another way. And then Jesus is not done. He has more to say on this matter about whether or not he's the Christ. He says, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power of God. Well, wow, he's just said it, but maybe he hasn't said enough. Because he said the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of God. He didn't yet say, I will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. So he might yet have an out, and they need to make this matter stick. So they're holding their collective breath, and someone asks, are you then the Son of God? And then without a hesitation, he answers them, yes, I am. So understand this. Jesus was crucified because he claimed to be the Son of God. It's very important to say this because there are religions in this world and there are people in this world that will say, well, Jesus was crucified, and they'll give you a number of reasons, but understand this. Yes, they hated him and wanted to kill him because they were jealous of him. That's all true. But the evidence that led to his crucifixion was one piece of evidence and only one. He claimed to be the Son of God. And it was C.S. Lewis, the brilliant Cambridge scholar, who I think said it well. If you live in a polytheistic environment, many gods, then for someone to say they're the Son of God might not be, a terrible thing to say. I mean, there's gods all over the place. But if you live in a monotheistic culture, then to say you're the Son of God is the ultimate blasphemous thing. So this is important for us to understand because, Jesus is saying something that at least the Jewish leaders think should never have been said. He is claiming equality with God. So, Lewis, when he was discussing this, said, we've got to stop coming up with this moralizing nonsense that says that Jesus was just a good teacher, or that he taught good moral principles, or even some that he was a social revolutionary, all of that stuff. Lewis said, let's stop with this patronizing nonsense about Jesus. Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, so either he is a lunatic, or he's a straight-up liar, or he is in fact who he says he was. But Lewis says, let's not kid ourselves anymore. Either Jesus is who he said he is, or he's a madman or something worse. That's in fact exactly what we read in this account. Jesus is making an astonishing claim, and out of that claim, of course, comes the fourth trial. And so the fourth trial is the first trial among the Gentiles. We now see that the Jews want to now bring Jesus to the Romans for trial. And the reason for that is because all the evidence that we have is that the Jews were not permitted to execute someone. That was in Rome's purview. So now they have to bring him to Pontius Pilate. So it's now early Friday morning. And Pontius Pilate, who is the Roman governor of the army, and he is usually stationed in Caesarea, but during Passover, because there's always a possibility of violence, the entire Roman contingent would have moved to Jerusalem, and he would have been in a place called the Antonia Fortress, which had a huge praetorium, a grand open courtyard in front of it. And so the Jewish high priests and the religious leaders are now bringing Jesus to Pilate. And they are saying to him, we have a man that we brought charges against. But here's where it gets crazy. They don't say to him, this man claimed to be the Son of God. Because I think the Jews were saying, you know, in Pilate's world, who's a polytheist? I mean, the Romans and the Greeks had gods upon gods. He might not hardly raise an eyebrow at that claim. He might say, you know, the guy's a madman. I've got enough madmen already that I have to oversee. I don't care about this guy. Let him go. So they need something that will work with Pilate. So they have their official charge from the Sanhedrin, but now they've got to come up with a new charge that will convince Pilate that he's got to put this man to death. So they come to Pilate and they say, well, listen, you know, this man, he claims that he is, we shouldn't be paying taxes to Caesar, and he claims that he himself is a king. Now, what's interesting is that they come before Pilate, and Pilate wants to invite them in, but they won't come in. They're standing on the outside because they say, we're not allowed to enter a Gentile residence. We'd be ritually unclean. I mean, you got to think about that. I mean, the hypocrisy is overwhelming. I mean, you know, the sixth command says you shall not murder, but they've been planning to murder this man. And the ninth command said, you shall not bear false witness, and they've been doing nothing other than bringing one false witness after another. You know, these men are ritually unclean in every sense of the word. And then this hypocrisy that says, you know, we can't enter into a Gentile residence. So Pilate simply takes Jesus by himself, leaves all the Jews standing outside, takes them inside of his own residence, and he asks them the question, straight up, are you the king of the Jews? Why not ask him? And Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would right now be in an armed crusade to stop my being arrested. But my kingdom is not of this world. Pilate said, good enough. Heard you out. I understand you're no threat to the Roman Empire. Trial is done. Innocent. He brings him out and he says, I find no reason to bring a charge against this man. And all of a sudden, it looks like the streets are going to explode in a riot. I mean, it turns out that the Jewish religious leaders have been working the crowd hard. The crowd has been gathering. They've been whispering rumors among the crowd. There's all sorts of stuff going, and people are now shouting out to Pilate. Now Pilate, he's what is he going to do right now? So he decides, well, I'm going to kick the can down the road just a little bit. And there starts the fifth trial of Jesus. Because it's Herod's jurisdiction, Galilee, and Herod is called the king of the Jews, he decides to do Herod a favor. The two men can't stand each other. They just absolutely hate each other. But on this day, Pilate decides to do Herod a favor. He's always wanted to meet with Jesus. He's going to send Jesus over to him. Let him be tried before Herod. Let Herod decide what he's going to do with the man. So Jesus goes and is brought over to Herod. And Herod is, he's the man that beheaded John the Baptist. He's a man that cares nothing about human life, but he wants to see Jesus. He's always wanted to see him, and he's never had the opportunity. And here stands Jesus in the flesh, and what Herod wants more than anything else, he wants Jesus to do a miracle right in front of him. Jesus stands there silently, will not say a single word to Herod. No matter how he's questioned, no matter how he's mocked, and they mocked him plenty in Herod's court. Jesus says nothing. Finally, they put a purple robe on him, and they call him the King of Madness, and they send him back to Pilate. And somehow, and we don't know how, but through that act, Pilate and Herod, who had been deadly enemies, became friends after that moment. It's an interesting thing. But that starts now the sixth trial. And Jesus is brought to Pilate, and Pilate is determined. He will not crucify Jesus. He's going to release him. One of the reasons has been that his wife has had a very disturbing dream. And in her dream, she comes to Pilate, her husband, and says, "Have no part in this man's death." And Pilate takes note. But meanwhile, there's a frenzy outside of his house, and they're screaming they want Jesus crucified. It's like mob justice, and Pilate decides he's going to settle on a course. He's not going to crucify him, but he's going to rough him up pretty good. So he brings Jesus to be beaten, scourged with whips. Now, if that doesn't mean a lot to us, let me explain a little bit. The Roman whips would be made of leather strands. I mean, they would have a solid, holding a handle, and then there would be leather strands, and in the leather strands would be bits of either bone or some other thing like that, and they would come down, and with every stripe, it would tear out flesh. So he basically had Jesus beaten so badly that the back of his back would have looked very much like it was just ground meat. I mean, they really beat him hard. Then they took a crown of thorns, which would have been about 1.5 inches, sharp nail-like thorns, and they ram it into the top of his head, and they mock him, saying, like, "Here's your crown, O king." Then they beat him in his face. They probably break his nose. He's now appearing before the people as a bloodied mess, and Pilate wants it this way. He wants Jesus utterly humiliated. He wants him so stripped of every bit of human dignity, so in pain that he can barely stand, and people are supposed to look at him and say, "You think that man's a threat? Here's the King of the Jews? Really? This is what you're worried about? My goodness, have a look at this man. I can do with him at any point in time what I want to. This man's no threat whatsoever." What's fascinating about that moment, because that's what Pilate thought would be the response. I mean, what else would they respond? They'd finally say, "Okay, we had way with him. Okay, we're done. We'll send him back to Galilee. He's humiliated. His ministry's basically over at this point in time." But that's not what happens. If you can imagine blood being poured into an ocean where there are sharks circling, there is madness at this point in time. Seeing the bloody Jesus doesn't satisfy them. It makes them more vengeful than ever before. Now they want him crucified more than anything else. And so in the midst of all of this, Pilate now hears among the shouting crowd something that makes his blood run cold. He savaged Jesus. That doesn't bother him. The battle-hardened soldiers, they don't care if they have one more victim. They've had enough. And so, but an awful statement gets made. He made himself to be the Son of God, somebody says. And Pilate hears that, and the reaction is different. He drags Jesus back into the praetorium. "Where do you come from?" he says. No answer. Pilate says, "Listen to me. You won't talk to me. I have the power of life or death over you." And Jesus responds by saying, "You would have no power over me if it had not been granted to you from above." Pilate knows instinctively that right that moment, his soul is being weighed as to what he's going to do next. He comes back and says, "I find no fault in him." But they say, if you release him, they say, "You are no friend of Caesar." See, it's important here to understand that at this moment in history, Pilate was having his own problems in Rome. He was walking through a political quagmire, and many in Rome were questioning his loyalties to Rome. And the chief priests knew that, and they said, "You let this guy go, we're going to report to Rome and to Caesar that there was a man who claimed to be the King of the Jews and the Jewish Messiah, and you let him go. What will they say about your loyalty then?" And Pilate recognizes he's been backed into a corner, and now he sounds like a pleading lamb. He says, "Will you crucify your king?" And they respond back and shout back, "We have no king but Caesar." Just stop for a moment and just think for a bit, because I know that in history, the Jews have been called Christ killers. It's one thing to say that the Romans joined together with the Jews to crucify Jesus, but in truth, the Romans would never have crucified Jesus had it not been for this one fact, that the Jews would not let Pilate off the hook. So that's just a case in point. Recognize also that even though the chief priests were giving leadership, they had whipped up the crowd to be screaming out, crucify him, so that mob justice pushed Pilate's hand. So how then should we think about the Jews? Should we think about them as Christ killers? And here I want to say 4 things. Number 1, please understand that all of these events were orchestrated by Jesus. I've said this over and over again. Jesus gave the religious leaders no choice but to put him to death in front of the people. Secondly, please understand Romans 3:19. In Romans 3:19, we read that the Jews are God's lesson book to the nation. The Jews aren't better than us. They're not worse than us. They are us. In fact, the Jews are a mirror into the soul of all humanity. What's done among the Jews is what's done among us. So please don't look at the Jews and say, look how much worse they are. In fact, they acted as all of us would have acted. The third thing I want to say, that Jesus giving his life was an atonement. It was necessary for our sins to be removed. And the final thing is simply this: because of these truths, there can be no anti-Semitism among Christians. The fact is, our Messiah is the Jewish Messiah. Our scriptures are the Jewish scriptures. The writers of the New Testament outside of Luke were all Jews. We can't be anti-Semites lest we deny our own faith. So these words, Christ killers, must never come from anyone who's committed to Jesus. Well, the trial of Jesus teaches us that all of humanity had no place for a king. You imagine Pilate. He goes to a dish and he ceremonially washes his hands and says, I am innocent of this man's blood. He's not innocent. He can wash his hands in that dish all day long. His hands continue to have the stain of the blood of Jesus on him. He is culpable in the death of Jesus. The Jewish high priests were culpable. The Roman soldiers were culpable. The screaming crowd was culpable. The entire human race is culpable in the death of Jesus. God sent us his Son. And we, seeing the Son of God, turned on him in wrath and nailed him to a cross. And Christ's death highlights the blackness that is not in just the Jewish heart. It is in the Jewish heart, and it is in the Gentile heart as well. We would not have the Son of God. We would not countenance him in our presence. We would rather nail him to a cross. Indeed, that's what the events of the morning of that Friday teaches us. Innocent of his blood, hardly. And for all of those who simply look at this as history, we need to say that Jesus' death teaches us that if there's anything that I need to do, I need to repent before God. I need to ask, oh God, I'm a sinner, and my sin is responsible for nailing Jesus to the cross. Forgive me, and give me the grace that comes through the very hand of the one I did not want, Jesus, the Son of God. Hey, thank you for watching today. May the Lord bless you as you walk with Christ. Good day. Thank you for watching today, and I want to ask you to make sure that you hit the like button and also subscribe to this channel so that you can receive any further notifications of all the videos that we prepare for you. Thank you so much for being a part of Back to the Bible Canada.